everyone, welcome back to part 2 of the Ted Bundy case. So let's dive straight back into this case. So the ending to the part 1 was where he had gone and fell over and hurt his ankle. So where he was very cold, he was very sleep deprived, and he was in constant pain, and this was to do with the sprained ankle that he had at the time. Bundy had drove back to Aspen, where 2 police officers then had noticed his car weaving in and out of its lane. Then they decided to try and pull him over. He had been a fugitive for at least 6 days at this point. In the car, there were maps of the mountain area and around Aspen, and these were some prosecutors ended up using this to demonstrate the location of where Campbell's body was at this time. So with then he had his own attorney, and Bundy had some rights of the discovery and indicating that his escape was not as very spontaneous as he put it out to be. Then he ended up back in jail then in Glenwood Springs. So Bundy had ignored the advice of his friends and the legal advisors to stay put. The case then went against him, already being weak at best, was deteriorating very steadily at the pre-trial motions. It was constantly then resolved in his favour, and then the significant bits of evidence were ruled in as admissible. Quote, "A more rational defendant might have realised that he stood a good chance of acquittal, and that beating the murder charge in Colorado would probably have dissuaded other prosecutors with as little as a year and a half to be served on at the Daronch conviction, and that Ted then had persevered, he could have been a free man." But instead, Bundy assembled a new escape plan. He acquired a very detailed floor plan of the Garfield County Jail, and he had a hacksaw blade from other inmates. He further then accumulated $500 in cash, something he later said was smuggled in over a 6-month period by visitors, which was Boone in particular. During the evenings, while other prisoners were showering, he had sawed a hole about 1 square foot between the steel reinforcing bars in his cell ceiling. Having lost roughly 35 pounds, he was able to wriggle through and to explore the crawl space above, allowing him to make a series of practice runs in the weeks that had followed. Multiple reports then from an informant of a movement within the ceiling during the night was not investigated. So by late 1977, impending trial had become a cause as a celebrity in the small town of Aspen. And Bundy had filed a motion for a change of venue to Denver. On December the 23rd, the Aspen trial judge then granted the request, but to Colorado Springs, where the juries had historically been hostile to the murder suspect. On the night of December the 30th, with most of the jail staff on a Christmas break and non-violent prisoners on furlough with their families, Bundy had piled some books and files in his bed. He also covered them with blankets to try and simulate his sleeping body, and climbed into a crawl space. He broke through the ceiling in the apartment of the chief jailer, who was out for the evening with his wife. He changed into street clothes from the jailer's closet and then walked out of the front door to freedom. After stealing a car, Bundy drove eastward out of Glenwood Springs, but the car soon broke down in the mountains on the Interstate 70. A passing motorist gave him a ride into the Vale of 60 miles to the east. From there, he caught a bus to Denver, where he boarded a morning flight to Chicago. Back in Glenwood Springs, the skeleton crew did not discover the escape until noon on December the 31st, more than 17 hours later. By then, Bundy was already in Chicago. From Chicago, Bundy had traveled by a train to Ann Arbor and Michigan, where he was present in a local tavern on January the 2nd. 5 days later, he stole a car and drove to South in Atlanta, where he boarded a bus and arrived in Tallahassee, Florida on the morning of January the 8th. He stayed for one night at a hotel before he rented a room under the alias Chris Hagan at a boarding house near the Florida State University, the FSU campus. Bundy later said that he initially resolved to find a legitimate employment and refrain from further criminal activity, knowing he could probably remain free and undetected in Florida indefinitely, as long as he did not attract any attention of the police. But his lone job application at a construction site had to be abandoned when he was asked to produce a form of identification. He referred to his old habits of shoplifting and stealing money and credit cards from women's wallets that left in shopping carts at local grocery stores. In the early hours of January the 15th, 1978, 1 week after his arrival in Tallahassee, Bundy gained access then at the FSU's Chi Omega sorority house through a rear door with a faulty locking mechanism. Beginning at about 2:45 a.m., he bludgeoned Margaret Bowman, age 21, with a heavy piece of oak firewood as she slept, crushing her skull. He then garroted her with a nylon stockings and ripped her underwear off with such force that friction burns were found on one of her thighs. After killing Bowman, he walked directly across the hall and entered the bedroom of the 20-year-old Lisa Levy, beating her unconditionally and strangling her, in what would become one of the key pieces of evidence against him at his trial. Bundy bit deeply into Levy's left buttock, and though one of her nipples, nearly severing it from her right breast, using it then a bottle of a mist Levy had in her room, he raped her vaginally, anally, and in an assault so violent that it ruptured her internal organs. In a adjoining bedroom, he attacked Kathy Kleiner, breaking her jaw and deeply lacerating her shoulder, and Karen Chandler, who suffered a concussion, a broken jaw, loss of teeth, a crushed finger. Chandler and Kleiner survived the attack. Kleiner attributed the survival to her automobile headlights that was illuminating in the interior of their room. And this frightened away the attacker. Fleeing the scene, Bundy was spotted by a sorority sister, Nita Neary, who came through the back door and saw him as he made a run for it. Tallahassee detectives determined that the 4 attacks took place in a total of less than 15 minutes, within earshot of more than 30 witnesses who heard nothing. Police converged on the sorority house not long after Bundy's rampage and began investigating the scene. Initially, the puncture wound through Levy's nipple briefly caused some to believe there had been a shooting at the sorority house, mistakenly believing it was a gunshot wound and not a bite mark. Although seriously injured, the unconscious Levy survived the assault at first and died shortly after, en route to the hospital. Within the next hour, Bundy donned a makeshift pantyhose mask with holes cut out of it for him to see through and made his way to the duplex house 8 blocks away, where he approached the apartment's basement window and climbed through there under the cover of darkness. Finding FSU student Cheryl Thomas asleep in her bed at around 4 a.m., Bundy viciously attacked her, dislocating her shoulder as well as fracturing her jaw and her skull in 5 places. She was left with permanent deafness and equilibrium damage that ended her dancing career. For unknown reasons, Bundy pulled his mask off and dropped it in the bed. Thomas's neighbours in the rooms adjacent overheard the racket and phoned the police, who discovered her lying in bed badly beaten. In addition to the mask, he had left it behind, which had contained hairs similar to Bundy's in class and characteristics. The police also found a semen stain on the bed, though there was no evidence of sexual assault. The fact that Bundy attacked Thomas so soon after the murders of Bowman and Levy was something that bewildered the law enforcement, with Sheriff Ken Katasarias initially expressing the shock and disbelief that the same person would strike twice in such a short time span. On February the 8th, Bundy drove 150 miles east to Jacksonville in a stolen FSU van. In a parking lot then, he approached the 14-year-old Leslie Parmenter, the daughter of the Jacksonville Police Department Chief of Detectives, identifying himself as Richard Burton, Fire Department, but retreated then when the Perimeter's older brother arrived and then confronted him. That afternoon, he backtracked 60 miles westward to the Lake City. At Lake City Junior High School the following morning, 12-year-old Kimberly Diane Leach was summoned to her homeroom by a teacher to retrieve a forgotten purse. She had never returned to class. 7 weeks later, after an intensive search, her partially mummified remains were found in a pig farrowing shed, which was near Suwannee River State Park, 35 miles northwest of the Lake City. The forensic experts then surmised that Leach had been raped with a knife before having her throat cut. On February the 12th, with insufficient cash to pay his overdue rent and a growing suspicion that police were closing in on him, Bundy stole a car and fled Tallahassee, driving westward across the Florida Panhandle. 3 days later, at around 1 a.m., he was stopped by Pensacola police officer David Lee, and this was near the Alabama state line after a want and warrants check showed on his Volkswagen Beetle as of stolen. When he was under arrest, Bundy kicked Lee's legs out from underneath him and took off running. Lee fired 2 warning shots, then gave chase and tackled him. The two struggled over Lee's gun before the officer finally subdued and arrested Bundy. In the stolen vehicle, there were 3 sets of IDs belonging to a female FSU student, 21 stolen credit cards, and a stolen television set. Also found were a pair of dark-rimmed non-prescription glasses and a pair of plaid slacks, later identified as the disguise worn by Richard Burton at the fire department in Jacksonville. As Lee transported his suspects to jail, unaware that he had just arrested one of the FBI's 10 most wanted fugitives, he heard Bundy say, "I wish you had killed me." Quote. Following a change of venue to the Miami, Bundy stood trial for the Chi Omega homicides and assaults in June 1979. The trial was covered then by 250 reporters from 5 continents and was the first to be televised nationally in the United States. Despite the presence of 5 court-appointed attorneys, Bundy again handled much of his own defense. From the beginning, he sabotaged the entire defense efforts out of the spite, distrust, and the grandeur delusion. Nelson later wrote, quote, Ted was facing murder charges with a possible death sentence, and all that mattered to him apparently was that he was to be in charge, quote. According to Mike Minerva, a Tallahassee public defender and a member of the defense team, a pre-trial plea bargain was negotiated in which Bundy would plead guilty to killing Levy, Bowman, and also Leach, in exchange for a firm 75-year prison sentence. The prosecutors was amenable to deal by the one account because, quote, prospects of losing at trial were very good. Bundy, on the other hand, saw the plea deal not only as a means of avoiding the death penalty, but also as a, quote, factical move. He could enter his plea, then wait a few years for evidence to disintegrate or become lost and for witnesses to die, or also to move on or to retreat and or retract their testimonies. Once the case again then went against him, it had deteriorated beyond repair, he could file a post-conviction motion to set aside the plea and secure a acquittal. At the last minute, however, Bundy refused the deal. Quote, it made him realize he was going to have to stand up in front of the whole world and say he was guilty, quote. Minerva said, quote, he just couldn't do it. At trial, crucial testimony came from Chi Amigo sorority members Connie Hastings, who placed Bundy in the vicinity of the sorority house that evening, and Nita Neary, who saw him leaving the house clutching the murder weapon. Incriminating physical evidence included impressions of the bite wounds Bundy had inflicted on Levy's left buttock, which forensics Richard Souvrian and Lowell Levine matched to Ted Bundy's teeth. The jury deliberated for less than 7 hours before convicting Bundy on July the 24th, 1979, of the Bowman and Levy murders, 3 counts of attempted first-degree murder for the assaults on Kleiner, Chandler, and Thomas, 2 counts of burglary. Trial Judge Edward Cowart imposed death sentences for the murder convictions. 6 months later, a second trial took place in Orlando for the abduction and murder of Leach. Bundy was found guilty once again after less than 8 hours deliberation, due principally to the testimony of an eyewitness who saw him leading Leach from the schoolyard to his stolen van. Important material evidence included clothing fibres with an unusual manufacturing error found in the van and on Leach's body, which had matched fibres from Ted's jacket when Ted was arrested. During the penalty phase of Leach's trial, Bundy then took advantage of an obscure Florida law providing that a marriage declaration in court in the presence of a judge constituted a legal marriage, as he was questioning Boone, who had moved to Florida to become very close to Bundy. Also, she had testified on his behalf during both trials and was again testifying on his behalf as a character witness. He had asked her to marry him. She accepted it, and Bundy declared to the court that they were legally married. On February the 10th, 1980, Bundy was sentenced for the 3rd time to death by electrocution. As the sentence was announced, he reportedly stood and shouted, quote, tell the jury they were wrong. The 3rd death sentence would be the one ultimately carried out nearly 9 years later. In October 1981, Boone gave birth to a daughter. rose and named Bundy as the father, while conjugal visits were not allowed at the Florida State Prison, and in Rayford, where Bundy was incarcerated, inmate were known to pool and also with their money in order to bribe the guards to allow them the intimate time alone with their female visitors. Shortly after the conclusion of Leach's trial and the beginning of the long appeals process that followed, Bundy initiated a series of interviews with Stephen Michaud and also Hugh Ainsworth as well. Speaking mostly in a third person to avoid the stigma of confession, he began for the first time to divulge details of his crimes and his thought processes. Bundy recounted his career as a thief, confirming Clover's long-time suspicion that he had shoplifted virtually everything of substance that he had owned. Quote, "The big payoff for me," he said, "was actually possessing whatever it was I had stolen. I really enjoyed having something that I wanted to have and also went out and got and taken them. Possession proved to be an important motive for rape and murder as well. Sexual assault," he said, "fulfilled his need to totally possess his victims. At first, he killed his victims, quote, as a matter of expediency to eliminate the possibility of being caught. But later, murder became part of the adventure. The ultimate possession was in fact the taking of the life," he said, "and then the physical possession is of the remains." Bundy had confided in a special agent, William Hagmaier, of the FBI Behavioral Analyst Unit. Hagmaier was struck by the deep, almost mystical satisfaction that Bundy had took in as murder. He said that after a while, murder is not just a crime of lust or violence, Hagmaier had related. It becomes possession. They are part of you. The victim becomes a part of you, and you two are forever one. And the grounds where you killed them or leave them become scared of you, and you will always be drawn back to them. Bundy told Hagmaier that he considered himself to be an amateur and impulsive killer in his years, before moving into what he termed his prime or predator phase about the time of the Healy's murder in 1974. This implied that he began killing well before 1974, although he never explicitly admitted having done so. In July 1984, prison guards found two axle blades hidden in Bundy's cell. A steel bar in one of the cell windows had been sawed completely through at top and bottom and glued back into place with a homemade soap-based adhesive. Several months later, the guards found an unauthorized mirror and that Bundy was moved to a different cell. Shortly thereafter, he was charged with the disciplinary infraction of unauthorized correspondence with another high-profile criminal, John Hinckley Jr. In October 1984, Bundy contacted Keppel and offered to share his self-proclaimed expertise in the serial killer psychology in the ongoing hunt in Washington for the, quote, Green River Killer, later identified as Gary Ridgway. Keppel and Green River Task Force Detective Day Reichert interviewed Bundy, but Ridgway remained at large for a further 17 years. Keppel published a detailed documentation of the Green River interviews and later collaborated with Michaud and other examination of the interview material. In the early 1986, a execution date, March the 4th, was set on the Chi Omega conviction. The U.S. Supreme Court issued a brief stay, but the execution was quickly rescheduled. In April, shortly after the new date, which was July the 2nd, was announced, Bundy finally confessed to Hagmaier and Nielsen that they believed that he was the full range of his depredations, including details of what he did to some of his victims. After their deaths, he had told them that he revisited Taylor Mountain in Issachar and other secondary crime scenes, often several times, to lie with his victims and perform sexual acts with their bodies until putrefaction had forced him to stop. In some cases, he drove for several hours each way and remained the entire night. In Utah, he applied makeup on Smith's lifeless face and repeatedly washed Ames's hair. Quote, "If you've got time," he told Hagmeyer, "they can be anything you want them to be." He decapitated approximately 12 victims with a hacksaw and kept at least one group of severed heads, probably the 4 later found on Taylor Mountain, which was Rancourt, Parks, Ball, and Healy, in his apartment for a period of time before he went and disposed of them. Less than 15 hours before the scheduled July the 2nd execution, the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals stayed then indefinitely and remanded the Chiamega case for review on multiple technicalities, including Bundy's mental competency and the Stant trial and the erroneous instruction by the trial judge during the penalty phase, requiring the jury to break a 6-6 tie between them, between the life imprisonment and the death penalty, which ultimately were never resolved. A new date, November 18th, was then set to carry out the Leach state sentence. The 11th Circuit Court issued a stay on November the 17th. In mid-1988, the 11th Circuit ruled against Bundy. In December, the Supreme Court denied a motion to review the ruling over the dissents of the justices. Thurgood Marshall and Williams J. Brennan, Jr., within hours of that final denial, a firm execution date of January the 24th, 1989, was announced. Bundy's journey through the appeal court had been unusually rapid for the capital murder case. Quote, "Contrary to popular belief, the courts moved Bundy as fast as they could. Even the prosecutors acknowledged that Bundy's lawyers never employed delaying tactics, though people everywhere seized at the apparent delay in executing the archman. Ted Bundy was actually on the fast track. Will all appeal avenues exhausted and no further motivation to deny his crimes?" Bundy agreed to speak frankly with the investigators. He confessed to Keppel that he had committed all 8 of the Washington and Oregon homicides, for which he was the prime suspect, and he had described 3 additional previously unknown victims in Washington and 2 in Oregon, whom he declined to identify, if indeed he ever knew the identifications. He had said that he left a 5th corpse Manson's on Taylor Mountain, but incinerated her head in Clover's fireplace. Quote, he described the Issachar crime scene where the bones of Ott, Naslund and Hawkins was found, and it was almost like he was just there, Keppel said. Like he was just seeing everything. He was infatuated with the idea because he spent so much time there. He is just totally consumed with murder all the time. Nelson's impressions were similar. Quote, it was the absolute misogyny of his crimes that stunned me, she wrote. Quote, his manifested rage against women, he had no compassion at all. He was totally engrossed in the details of his murders, with his life's accomplishments. Bundy confessed to detectives from Idaho and Utah and Colorado that he had committed numerous additional homicides, including several that were unknown to the police. He explained that he was in Utah and he could have brought his victims back to his apartment. quote, where he could reenact scenarios depicted on the covers of the detective magazines. A new ulterior strategy quickly became apparent, and he withheld many details. Colorado Detective Matt Lindvall interpreted this as a conflict between his desire to postpone his execution by divulging some information and his need to remain in total possession, the only person who knew his victims' true resting places. When it became clear that no further stays would be forthcoming from the courts, Bundy's supporters began lobbying for the only remaining option and the executive clemency. Diana Weiner, a young Florida attorney and Bundy's last purported love interest, asked the families of several Colorado and Utah victims to petition Florida Governor Bob Martinez for a postponement to give Bundy time to reveal more information, but they all refused. Quote, "The families already believed that the victims were dead and that Ted had killed them," wrote Nelson. "They didn't need his confession. Martinez made it clear that he would not agree to further delays in any case. We are not going to have the system manipulated," he told the reporters. "For him to be negotiating for his life over the body of victims is despicable." Boone had championed Bundy's innocence throughout all of his trials and felt deeply betrayed by his admission that he was in fact guilty. She moved back to Washington with her daughter and refused to accept his phone call on the morning of his execution. Quote, "She was hurt by the relationship he had with Diana Weiner," Nelson wrote, "and devastated by his sudden, wholesale confessions in the last of his days." Hagmaier had present during Bundy's final interviews with investigations on the eve of his execution. He talked of suicide. He did not want to give the state the satisfaction of watching him die. Hagmaier said Bundy was executed in the Rayford electric chair at 7:16 a.m. EST time on Tuesday, January 24th, 1989. His last words were directed at his attorney Jim Coleman and the Methodist minister Fred Lawrence. Quote, "Jim and Fred, I'd like you to give my love to my family and friends." Hundreds of revelers sang, danced, and set off fireworks in the pasture across from the prison as he was executed, then cheered as the white hearse containing Bundy's corpse departed the prison. He was cremated in Gainesville and the ashes were scattered at an undisclosed location. In the Cascade Range of Washington state, in accordance with his will, Bundy was an unusually organized and calculated criminal who used his extensive knowledge of law enforcement methodologies to elude identification and capture for years. His crime scenes were distributed over large geographic areas. His victims are caught and had risen to at least 20 before it became clear that numerous investigators in the wildly desperate jurisdictions were hunting the same man. Bundy's assault methods of choice were blunt force trauma and strangulation, two relatively silent techniques that could be accomplished with common household items. He deliberately avoided firearms due to the noise they made and the ballistic evidence they left behind. He was a meticulous researcher who explored his surroundings in a minute's detail, looking for safe sites to seize and dispose of his victims. He was unusually skilled at minimizing physical evidence. His fingerprints were never found at a crime scene, nor any incontrovertible evidence of his guilt, a fact he repeated often during the years in which he tried to maintain in his own innocence. Other significant obstacles for law enforcement were Bundy's generic, essentially anonymous physical features and a curious chameleon-like ability to change his appearance almost at will. Early on, police complained of the futility of showing his photograph to witnesses. He looked different in virtually every photo ever taken of him. In person, his expression would change his whole appearance, that there were moments that you weren't even sure you were looking at the same person, said Stuart Hanson Jr., the judge in the Durant trial. He was really a changeling. Bundy was well aware of his unusual quality and he exploited it, using subtle modifications of facial hair or hairstyle to significantly alter his appearance as necessary. He concealed his one distinctive identifying mark, a mark of a dark mole on his neck, with turtlenecks, shirts, and sweaters. Even his Volkswagen Beetle proved difficult to pin down. Its color was variously described by witnesses as a metallic or non-metallic tan, or bronze, or light brown, or dark brown. Bundy's modus operandi evolved in organization and sophistication over time as a typical serial killer, according to all the FBI experts. Early on, it consisted of forcible late-night entry followed by a violent attack with a blunt weapon on a sleeping victim. As Bundy's method evolved, he became progressively more organized in his choice of victims and the crime scenes. He would employ various ruses designed to lure his victim to the vicinity of his vehicle, where he had pre-positioned a weapon, usually a crowbar. In many cases, he wore a plaster cast on one leg or a sling on one arm, sometimes hobbled on crutches, then requested assistance in carrying something to his vehicle. Bundy was regarded as handsome and a charismatic trait. He exploited to win the confidence of his victims and the people around him in his daily life. Quote, Ted lured his females, Michaud said, the way a lifeless silk flower can dupe a honeybee. In situations where his looks and his charm were not useful, he invoked authorities by identifying himself as a police officer or firefighter. Once Bundy had them near or inside his vehicle, he had overpowered and bludgeoned them, then restrained them with handcuffs. He would then transport them to a pre-selected secondary site, often a considerable distance far away, and then strangle them by a garrote during an act of rape. In the case of the Utah victims, the secondary site would be his apartment building toward the end of the spree. In Florida, perhaps under the stress of being a fugitive, he regressed to indiscriminate attacks on his sleeping victims. At secondary sites, Bundy would remove or later burn the victims' clothing. In or at least one case, Cunningham's deposit them in a Goodwill Industry collection bin. He explained that the clothing removal was ritualistic, but also a practical matter, as it minimized the chance of leaving trace behind at the crime scene. That could implicate him. A manufacturing error in fibers from his own clothing ironically provided a crucial incriminating link to Leach's killing. He often revisited his secondary crime scene to engage in acts of necrophilia and to groom or dress up the cadavers. Some victims were found wearing articles of clothing they never worn, or even nail polish that families never seen before. Bundy took Polaroid photos of many of his victims. Quote, when you work hard to do something right, he told Hagmeyer, you don't want to forget it. Consumption of a large quantity of alcohol was essential to the component. He told both Keppel and Michaud he needed to be extremely drunk while on the prowl, in order to significantly diminish his inhibitions and to sedate the dominant personality that he feared might prevent his inner entity from acting on his impulses. All of Bundy's known victims were white females, most of middle-class backgrounds. Almost all were between ages 15 to 25. Most were college students. He apparently never approached anyone he might have met before. In either their last conversation before his execution, Bundy told Clover he had purposely stayed away from her when he felt the power of his sickness building in him. Rule noted that the most of the identified victims had long straight hair, parted in the middle, like Diane Edwards, the woman who rejected him and to whom he later became engaged and then rejected in return. Rule speculated that Bundy's animosity towards his first girlfriend triggered his protracted rampage and caused him to target victims who resembled her. Bundy dismissed this hypothesis. They just fit the general criteria of being young and attractive, he had gone and told Ainsworth. Quote, too many people have brought this crap that all the girls were similar, but almost everything was dissimilar. Physically, they were almost all different. He had conceded that youth and beauty were absolutely indispensable criteria in his choice of victims. After Bundy's execution, Rule was surprised and troubled to hear from numerous sensitive, intelligent, kind young women who wrote or called to say that they were deeply depressed because Bundy was dead. Many had corresponded with him and to believing that she was his one and only. Several said they suffered nervous breakdowns when he died. Even in death, Ted damaged women, Rule wrote. To get well, they must realize they were conned by a con man. They are grieving for a shadow man that never existed. Bundy underwent multiple psychiatric examinations. The expert conclusions varied. Dorothy Otnow Lewis, a professor of the psychiatry at the New York University School of Medicine and the Authority on Violent Behavior, initially made a diagnosis of bipolar disorder, but later changed her impression more than once. She also suggested that the possibility of a multiple personality disorder based on behaviors described in interviews and court testimonies. A great aunt witnessed an episode during which Bundy seemed to turn into another unrecognizable person. She suddenly, inexplicably found herself afraid of her favorite nephew. As they waited together at a dusk-darkened train station, he turned into a stranger. Lewis recounted a prison officer in Tallahassee describing a similar transformation. Quote, he said, he became weird on me. He did a metamorphosis, a body and facial change, and he felt there was almost a odor emanating from him, he said. Quote, almost a complete change of personality. That was the day I was afraid of him. While experts found Bundy's precise diagnosis elusive and majority of evidence pointed away from bipolar or other psychoses and towards antisocial behavior personality disorder, ASPD. Bundy displayed many personality traits typically found in ASPD patients, who are often identified as psychopaths or sociopaths, such as the outward charm and charisma with little true personality or genuine insight beneath the facade, the ability to distinguish right from wrong, but with minimal effects of behavior, and an absence of guilt or remorse. Guilt doesn't solve anything really, Bundy said in 1981. It hurts you, I guess. I am not the invariable position of not having to deal with guilt. There was also evidence of narcissism, poor judgment, and manipulative behavior. Sociopaths, prosecutor Dodd Deckel wrote, are egoistical manipulators who think they can con anybody. Sometimes he manipulates me, admitted one psychiatrist in the end. Lewis agreed with the majority. I always tell my graduate students that if they can find me a real true psychopath, I'll buy them dinner, she told Nelson. I never thought they existed, but I think Ted may have been one. A true psychopath without any remorse or empathy at all. Narcissistic personality disorder, NPD, has been proposed as an alternative diagnosis in at least one subsequent retrospective analysis. On the afternoon before he was executed, Bundy granted an interview to James Dobson, a psychologist and a founder of the Christian Evangelical organization that had focused on the family. He used the opportunity to make new claims about violence in the media and the pornographic roots of his crimes. It happened in stages. Gradually, he said, my experience with pornography that deals on a violent level with sexuality is one that became addicted to it. I would keep looking for more potent, more explicit, more graphic kinds of material, until you reach a point where there is pornography only goes so far where you begin to wonder if maybe actually doing it will give you that which is beyond just reading it or looking at it. Violence in the media, he said, particularly sexualized violence, sent boys down the road to being Ted Bundys. The FBI, he suggested, should stake out adult movie houses and follow patrons as they leave. You are going to kill me, he said, and that will protect the society from me. But out there are many, many more people who are addicted to pornography, and you're doing nothing about that. While Nelson was apparently convinced that Bundy's concern was genuine, most biographers and researchers and other observers had concluded that his sudden condemnation of pornography was one last manipulative attempt to shift blame to Catherine Dobson as a critic. He told Dobson that true crime detective magazines had corrupted him and fueled his fantasies to the point of becoming a serial killer. Yet, in 1977, the letter to Rule, he wrote, who in the world reads these publications? I have never purchased such a magazine, and on only 2 or 3 occasions have I ever picked one up. He told me Shaw and Ainsworth in 1980 and Hagmeyer the night before he spoke to Dobson that pornography played a negligible role in his development as a serial killer. The problem wasn't pornography, wrote Deckel. The problem was then of Bundy. I wish I could believe that his motives were altruistic, wrote Rule, but all I can see is that Dobson's tape is another Ted Bundy manipulation of our minds. The effects of the tape is to place once again the onus of his crimes, not on himself, but on us. Rule and Ainsworth both noted that for Bundy, the fault always lay with someone or something else. While he eventually confessed to 30 murders, he never accepted responsibility for them, even when offered that opportunity prior to the Chiamega trial, which would have spared him the death penalty. He deflected blame onto the wide variety of scapegoats, including his abusive grandfather and also the absence of his own paternal father. The concealment of his true parentage by his mother, alcohol, the media, the police, whom he accused of planting evidence, society in general, violence on television, and ultimately true crime periodicals and pornography. He blamed television programming, which he watched mostly on sets that he had stolen, for brainwashing him into stealing credit cards. On at least one occasion, he even tried to blame his victims. I have known people who radiate vulnerability, he wrote in 1977 letter to Klopfer. Their facial expressions say, I am afraid of you. These people invite abuse, and by expecting to be heard, as they do subtly encourage it. A significant element of delusion permeated in his thinking. Bundy was always surprised when anyone noticed that one of his victims was missing, because of the imagined America to be a place where everyone is invisible except themselves. And he was always astounded when people testified that they had seen him in incriminating places, because Bundy did not believe people noticed each other. I don't know why everyone is out to get me, he complained to Lewis. He really and truly did not have any sense of enormity of what he had done, she had said. A long-term serial killer erects powerful barriers to his guilt, Keppel wrote. Walls of denial that consumes never be breached. Nelson agreed. Each time he was forced to make an actual confession, she wrote, he had to leap a steep barrier he had built inside himself long ago. Upon assessment, using the psychopathy checklist revisited the PCLR, Bundy was reportedly evaluated as 39 to 40. The night before his execution, Bundy confessed to 30 homicides, but the true total remains unknown. Published estimates have run as high as 100 or more, and Bundy occasionally made cryptic comments to encourage that speculation. He told Ainsworth in 1980 that the every murder publicized, there could be one that was not. When FBI agents proposed a total tally of 36, Bundy responded, add one digit to that and you'll have it. Years later, he told Nelson that he had commonly estimated of 35 was accurate, but Keppel wrote that Ted and I both knew the total was much higher. I don't think even he knew how many he killed or why he had killed them. Also said that Reverend Fred Lawrence, the Methodist clergyman who administered Bundy's last rites, that was my impression, my strong impression. On the evening before his execution, Bundy reviewed his victimally with Hagmeyer on a state by the state basis for a total of 30 homicides. In Washington, 11, including Parks, abducted in Oregon but killed in Washington, and included 3 unidentified. In Utah is 8 and 3 unidentified. Colorado is 3, Florida 3, Oregon 2, both unidentified. Idaho 2, 1 is unidentified. California 1 and 1 is unidentified. The following is a chronological summary of 20 identified victims and 9 identified survivors. Victim 1, Karen Sparks, age 18. Crime happened on January the 4th in Washington. She survived. She often identified as Joni Lenz in Bundy's literature. Bundy bludgeoned Karen with a metal rod from a bed frame, sexually assaulted her with the metal rod, causing extensive internal injuries. She remained unconscious in the hospital for 10 days, but she had survived. Victim 2, Linda Hall Ely, age 21. Crime happened on February the 1st in Washington. She was killed. She had been bludgeoned, decapitated, dismembered. She had been found on March the 3rd, 1975. She was beaten unconscious, dressed in a blue jeans and a white blouse, and she had boots as well. She was carried away, then decapitated, then dismembered. Her mandible was recovered at Taylor Mountain, Washington site in 1975 and was matched through some dental records. Victim 3, Donna Gail Manson, age 19. Crime happened on March the 12th in Washington. She'd been killed. She was abducted, and the exact cause of death is unknown. She'd never been found. She had been abducted while walking into a concert at Evergreen State College. Body left according to Bundy at Taylor Mountain site, but was never found. Victim 4, Susan Elaine Rancourt, age 18. Crime happened on April 17th in Washington. She was killed and abducted. Her exact cause of death is unknown. Her skull and mandible was only found on March the 3rd, 1975. She disappeared after attending an evening advisors meeting at the Central London and Washington State College. Her skull and mandible was found at Taylor Mountain site in 1975. Victim 5, Roberta Kathleen Parks, age 22. Crime was on May the 6th in Oregon. She was killed, abducted. Exact cause of death is unknown. Her skull and mandible was found on March 3rd, 1975 on Taylor Mountain. She vanished from Oregon State University in Corvallis in Oregon. Victim 6, Brenda Carol Ball, age 22. The crime was on June the 1st in Washington. She was killed and abducted. Her cause of death is unknown. Her skull and mandible was found on March the 3rd, 1975. She disappeared after leaving the Flame Tavern in Burien, and her skull and mandible was found on Taylor Mountain in 1975. Victim 7, Georgianne Hawkins, age 18. The crime was on June 11th in Washington. She was killed and abducted. It was also strangulation, and according to Bundy, it was decapitation. The skeleton remains was found on September the 6th, 1974. She was abducted from an alley behind her sorority house, the UW. Her remains were identified by Bundy as Hawkins. That was recovered as Isaac's site. Bundy used Hawkins's head as a trophy. Victim 8, Janice Graham, 22. The crime was on July the 14th in Washington. She survived. It was the attempt to abduct Janice from the Lake Shamish at the skate park, but she had escaped. Victim 9, which is Janice Ann Ott, age 23. Crime was on July the 14th in Washington. She was killed and abducted and strangled, and according to Bundy, she was decapitated. Her skeletal remains was found in September in 1974 at Issacar. Victim 10, Cindy Siebenham, age 16. Crime happened on July the 14th in Washington. She survived an attempted abduction from Lake Samish and also the park restroom. She had escaped. Victim 11, Patricia Ann Turner, unknown age. Crime happened in July the 14th in Washington. She survived an attempted abduction from Lake Samish Park. She also escaped. Victim 12, Jacqueline Pliski, unknown age. Crime was on July the 14th in Washington. She survived an attempted abduction from Lake Samish Park at the restrooms, and she also escaped. Victim 13, Denise Marie Naslund, age 19. Crime was on July the 14th in Washington. She was killed. She was abducted. The cause of death is unknown. She was abducted 4 hours after Janice Ott from the same place, and her remains was found at the Issacar. Victim 14, Nancy Wilcox, age 16. Crime was on October the 2nd in Utah. She was killed. She was abducted, and her cause of death is unknown. She still has not been found. She disappeared in Holiday in Utah. Her body is buried, according to Bundy, near Capitol Reef National Park, which is 200 miles south of Salt Lake City. Victim 15, Melissa Ann Smith, age 17. Crime was in October the 18th in Utah. She was killed. She got abducted and was strangled. Her body was found on October the 27th, 1974. She vanished from Midvale in Utah, and her body was found 9 days later on the hillside in the Summit Park. She was beaten, raped, sodomized, and strangled with nylon stockings. Bundy shampooed her hair and applied makeup to her body after her death. Victim 16, Laura Ann Aim, age 17. Crime was on October the 31st in Utah. She was killed. She was abducted and strangled. Her body was found on November the 28th, 1974. She had disappeared in Lehi in Utah. Her body was discovered by hikers in the American Fork Canyon. She was beaten, raped, sodomized, and strangled with some nylon stockings. Victim 17, Carol Daronch, age 18. Crime happened on November the 8th in Utah. She survived the abduction. It was in Murray in Utah. Escaped from Bundy's car and survived. Victim 18, Deborah Jean Kent, age 17. The crime was on November the 8th in Utah. She was killed, she was abducted, and the exact cause of death was unknown. She was found as and identified in 2015. She vanished after leaving a school play in Bountiful in Utah. The body was left, according to Bundy, near Fairview, Utah, 100 miles south of Bountiful. The minimal skeleton remains, one patella found, were positively identified by DNA as Kent in 2015. Victim 19, Karen Eileen Campbell, age 23. Crime happened on January the 12th in Colorado. She was killed and abducted. She had blunt force trauma to her head. Her body was found in February the 17th, 1975. She disappeared from a hotel hallway in Snowmass, and her new body was discovered 36 days later on a dirt road near a hotel. Victim 20, Julie Cunningham, age 26. The crime was on March 15th in Colorado. She was killed. She was abducted, and the exact cause of death is unknown. She never been found. She's Bundy's oldest known victim that disappeared on the way to a tavern in Vail in Colorado. Her body was buried, according to Bundy, near Rifle in 90 miles west of Vail, but never been found. Victim 21, Denise Lynn Oliverson, age 25. The crime happened on April 6 in Colorado. She was killed. She'd been abducted, and her exact cause of death is unknown. She never been found. She was abducted while cycling to her parents' house in Grand Junction, Colorado. The body was thrown, according to Bundy, into a Colorado River 5 miles west of Grand Junction, but was never found. Victim 22, Lynette Dawn Culver, age 12. Crime was on May the 6th, and this was in Idaho. She was killed, and she was abducted and drowned. She never been found. She is Bundy's youngest known victim, and abducted from Alameda in junior high school in Pocatello, Idaho. Body was thrown into what authorities believe it to be as the Snake River, but has not been found. Victim 23, Susan Curtis, age 15. Crime was on June 28th in Idaho. She was killed. She'd been abducted. The cause of death is unknown. She never been found, and she disappeared during youth conference at Brigham in the Young University. Her body was buried, according to Bundy, near Price in Utah, 75 miles southeast of Provo, but have never been found. Victim 24, Margaret Elizabeth Bowman, age 21. On January the 15th, the crime happened in Florida. She had been killed by bludgeoning and strangulation. She'd been found minutes after her murder, was bludgeoned with a piece of oak firewood, and then strangled with nylon stockings as she slept. The Chi Omega sorority FSU, first of 5 victims within 15 minutes. There was no secondary crime scene. Victim 25, Lisa Levy, age 20. Crime happened on January 15th in Florida and killed. There was bludgeoning and strangulation. Found minutes after a murder. Bundy beat Levy unconscious and strangled her, bit deeply into her left buttock and through her nipple on her right breast, and she was actually sexually assaulted too. And that was being used with a hair mist bottle. So that's how she was getting sexually assaulted, was with her hair mist bottle. The attack was also very violent, that it ruptured her internal organs. The Chi Omega sorority FSU, and also there is no secondary crime scene. Victim 26, Kathy Kleiner, age 21. Crime was January the 15th in Florida. She survived. She was bludgeoned as she slept in Chi Omega sorority FSU. Victim 27, Karen Chandler, age 21. Crime was on January the 15th in Florida. She survived. She'd been bludgeoned as she slept in the Chi Omega sorority, which was the FSU. Victim 28, Cheryl Thomas, age 21. Crime was on January the 15th in Florida. She survived. She had also been bludgeoned as she slept. 8 blocks from Chi Omega sustained injuries that ended her dancing career. Victim 29, Kimberly Diane Leach, age 12. The crime was on February the 9th in Florida. She had been killed. She had got abducted. She had been bleeding from the neck. There was lacerations with a knife, and also her remains were found in the Lake City. She got abducted from a junior high school in the Lake City in Florida, and she had been mummified. On the campus of the morning, his daughter disappeared. There were other circumstantial evidence implicating Bundy as well, but detectives that were familiar with the case have never agreed on the likelihood of his involvement. Bundy repeatedly denied culpability and wrote a letter of denial to the Burr family in 1986. But Keppel was observed that the Burr case fits all 3 categories of the murders. Bundy would never talk about too close to home, too close to family, and very young. Forensic testing of material evidence from the Burr crime scene in 2011 yielded insufficient intact DNA sequences for the comparison with Bundy's and such is involvement in remains that was speculative. Lisa E. Wick, age 20, last seen on June 23, 1966. She survived. She was a flight attendant who was bludgeoned with a piece of lumber as she slept in a basement apartment in the Seattle, then in the Queen Anne neighborhood. On June 23, 1966, Keppel noted many similarities to the Chi Omega crime scene. She suffered permanent memory loss as a result of the attack. Later, she contacted Rule and said, "I know that it was Ted who had done this to me." She wrote, "But I can't tell you how I know." In the absence of incriminating evidence, Bundy's involvements remained unconfirmed. Lonnie Ree Trumbull, age 20. June 23rd, 1966, when the crime happened, she got killed. She was also a flight attendant. She was bludgeoned with a piece of lumber as herself and Lisa Wick slept in their basement apartment in Seattle's Queen Anne's neighborhood. She had died, and in retrospect, Keppel noted many similarities of Chi Omega crime scene. Susan Margaret Davis, age 19. May the 30th, 1969. She went missing and ended up being killed. She'd been vacationing and the college friends Susan Margaret Davis and Elizabeth Perry, both 19, was stabbed to death on May the 30th, 1969. Their car was found on that day abandoned beside the Garden State Parkway outside Summers Point in New Jersey, near the Atlantic City, 60 miles southeast of Philadelphia, and their bodies, one were nude, one were fully clothed, were found in a nearby woods 3 days later. Bundy attended the Temple University from January through May 1969 and did not move west until it was Memorial Day. While his accounts of his earliest crimes varied considerably between interviews, he told forensic psychologist Art Norman that his first murder victim was 2 women in the Philadelphia area. Biographer Richard Larston believed that Bundy committed the murders using his find injury ruse, based on an investigator's interview with Julia, Bundy's aunt. Ted said that she was wearing a cast due to an automobile accident on the weekend of the homicides, and therefore could not have travelled from Philadelphia to the Jersey Shore. There is no official record of any such accident, and Bundy is considered a strong suspect, but the case remains open. Elizabeth Perry, aged 19, disappeared May 30th, 1969. She was killed. She had been vacationing with a college friend, Susan Margaret Davis, aged 19 also. They'd been stabbed to death. Their car was found then the day abandoned beside a Garden State Parkway outside Summers Point in New Jersey near Atlantic City, which was 60 miles southeast of Philadelphia. They had been one nude, other was fully clothed and found in the woods, which were 3 days later. Rita Patricia Curran, age 24, disappeared on July the 19th, 1971. She got killed. Rita had been an elementary school teacher and a part-time motel maid. She was murdered in her basement apartment on July the 19th, 1971 in Burlington in Vermont. She was strangled, bludgeoned and raped. The location of the motel where she worked adjacent to Bundy's birthplace, the Elizabeth Lund Home for Unwed Mothers, and similarities to known Bundy's crime scenes led to the retired FBI agent John Bassett to propose him as a suspect. Bundy told Keppel then that he had murdered a young woman that was in 1971 in Burlington when he was there to obtain information about his birth, but denied specific involvement in the Curran case to Hagmaier on the eve of his execution. No evidence firmly places Bundy in Burlington on that date, but municipal records note that a person named Bundy was bitten by a dog that week, and long stretches of Bundy's time, including the summer of 1971, remains unaccounted for. Curran's murder officially remains unsolved. Joyce Margaret LePage, age 21, disappeared in July 22nd, 1971. She had been killed, and Joyce was last seen on the campus of Washington State University, where she was undergraduate. 9 months later, her skeleton remains were found wrapped in a carpeting and military blankets bound with rope in a deep ravine south of Pullman, Washington. Multiple suspects, included Bundy, have never been cleared. According to investigators, Whitman's County authorities have said that Bundy remains a suspect. Rita Lorraine Jolly, age 17, disappeared in June 29, 1973. She disappeared from West Lynn, Oregon. Bundy confessed to 2 homicides in Oregon without identifying the victims. Oregon detectives suspected that they were Jolly and Holler, but they were unable to obtain an interview with Bundy to confirm it. Both women remains classified as missing. Vicky Lynn Holler, age 24, disappeared on August 20th, 1973. She disappeared in Eugene in Oregon. Herself, alongside with Jolly, are suspected victims of Bundy, and both remains classified as missing. Brenda Joy Baker, age 14, disappeared May 27th, 1974. She was seen hitchhiking near Puyallup, and her body was found in Millisylvania, a state park, a month later. Bundy was widely believed to be responsible for a murder. The DNA analysis led to the arrest and conviction of William E. Cosden for Catherine Mary Devine, which was age 14. The murder, as it was believed, Bundy may have been responsible for. As for Brenda, her case is unresolved. Sandra Jean Weaver, age 19, disappeared on July 1st, 1974. She was a Wisconsin native who had been living in Tulare in Utah. She was last seen in Salt Lake City on July 1st, 1974. Her new body was discovered the following day near Grand Junction in Colorado. Sources conflict on whether Bundy mentioned Weaver's name during the death row interviews. Her murder also remains unsolved. Melanie Suzanne Cody, aged 18, disappeared April 15th, 1975. She disappeared after leaving Netherland High School in Colorado, 50 miles northwest of Denver. Her bludgeoned and strangled corpse was discovered by the road maintenance workers. 2 weeks later, in Coal Creek Canyon, 20 miles away, gas station receipts had placed Bundy in a nearby Golden on the day Cooley had disappeared. She is included in some of the compilations of Bundy's victims, but Jefferson County authorities say the evidence is inconclusive and continues to treat the homicide as a cold case. Shirley K. Robertson, age 24, disappeared July 1st, 1975. She failed to show up for work in Golden, and her nude, decomposed body was found in August 500 feet inside of a mine on Berthoud Pass near Winter Park Resort by 2 mining students. Gas station receipts placed Bundy in the area at that time, but there is no direct evidence of his involvement in the case, and it also remains open. Nancy Perrin Bayard, age 23, disappeared on July 4th, 1975. She disappeared from the gas station where she worked in Layton in Utah, 25 miles north of Salt Lake City. On July 4th, 1975, she remains as a missing person. Bundy denied involvement in this case during the death row interviews. Debbie Smith, age 17, disappeared February 1976. She was last seen in Salt Lake City in early February. Shortly before the DeRanch trial began, her body was found near Salt Lake City International Airport on April 1st, 1976. Though this case is listed as Bundy's victim by some sources, but her murder remains unsolved. Minutes before Bundy's execution, Hagmeyer queried Bundy about unsolved homicides in New Jersey, in Vermont, Illinois, Texas, Miami, and Florida. Bundy provided directions later proven inaccurate to Susan Curtis's burial site in Utah, but denied involvement in any of the open cases. In 2011, Bundy's complete DNA profile obtained from a vial of his blood found in the evidence vault was also added to the FBI's DNA database for future references, and also there is to be involved with some unsolved murder cases. Okay then everyone, so that is the case of the Ted Bundy case. I really enjoyed it. I really enjoyed looking it up and getting all the information together. It is surprising how someone can just be very intelligent and be working with the law, and then they can just automatically become a serial killer. It is insane. This was one insane case that I have done up to date. If you enjoy my videos, please like, share, subscribe, and if there's any other cases you'd like me to do, then please feel free to comment in the comment section below. And then until next video, take care. Bye bye.